So the first real Christian film right out the gate is The Last Supper. I just saw it, so let's talk about it. This is out of Pinnacle Peaks, which is the same production company that produces the God's Not Dead movies. So Pure Flix, basically. This takes some liberties, biblically speaking. Nothing that would bother me. It's more just to establish some context for where we're going. The problem is like with this movie, I don't really know where we're going. It's kind of bland. It's kind of boring. I find myself kind of asking, okay, like what's the point? What's the central theme here? And yes, the movie is about Jesus and this part of the gospel story, but like there's no central theme. There's no nexus, no nucleus, if you will, for this movie. It's just, we're basically just reading the Bible, but in video form. So it's Mark 14, if you will, starting at verse 12 and going through the end of the chapter. Why Mark 14? Why do I say the book of Mark? Because this story here is from Peter's perspective. And it's long thought that the book of Mark is Peter's perspective on what happened. Aside from it being boring and bland, yes, it is, there are some things they do that I thought were very interesting and clever, if you will. This is where the spoilers come in, and there really shouldn't be any spoilers for you. I mean, again, this is basically the Bible, the book of Mark, chapter 14. And what we know about Peter's involvement in the gospel story is that he never made it to the cross. John went with him all the way. Now, you had all the disciples basically in the garden. They scattered. Peter stayed with him up until a certain point. Then people started to recognize him, and that's where he denies him 3 times. He breaks down, he cries, and we don't see Peter again until right after Jesus' death, prior to the resurrection. What I'm saying is we don't see the crucifixion. We see a little bit, and it's basically from John retelling what happened to Peter, but we don't see the crucifixion at all. We don't even really see the resurrection. I don't know why they didn't add that part, but we do see, some days later when the disciples are at the Sea of Galilee fishing and they see Jesus again. So we get that part. I don't know why we didn't get, the resurrection when, Jesus first appears to them, when Peter and John find the tomb. That's part of Peter's redemption. I don't know why they left that out. That was weird. Not including the crucifixion, that made sense. But I thought it was interesting to that point that we're telling this from Peter's perspective, so we're only going to show you what Peter would have seen. Another thing I thought was very interesting, and this is where they also took a little bit of liberties, is we know that after Judas betrays Jesus, he is filled with guilt and remorse and tries to return the money and ends up himself. And we know that Judas did that someplace else, right? But they have him doing the thing in the middle of the city, and Peter ends up being the one to find his body in the film. That I thought was wonderfully done, in spite of the rest of the film. Because I've been saying this forever. I don't know why pastors don't talk about this more, but Judas and Peter committed the same sin. They both betrayed Jesus. And yet their outcomes were very different. I love how they did that. How Peter is overcome with guilt and shame for what he's done. He's breaking down, he's crying, finds Judas's body in even more remorse, because he feels not just responsible for what's happened to Jesus, he also feels responsible for what's happened to Judas, because he was kind of a de facto leader. He feels like he failed him, and that's when the devil starts to wanting to creep in his ear and telling him you'd be better off. And I love how we're seeing these two men basically did the same thing, and yet the outcomes were so different, showing just how powerful Jesus is, even as he's dying. With each, film that showcases something biblical in nature, it's interesting to see people's interpretations of the text and what you can glean from it. What I love about film and television adaptations of the Bible is that they're, allowing us to see things in context that might be difficult to see just, on the pages, because the Bible is just very straightforward, minus all the metaphors and whatnot, but it's very straightforward. And this movie takes us, I think, a little bit into the human condition, showing us a bit of the confusion on part of the disciples when Jesus was doing things that didn't make sense. When he's flipping tables in the temple, when he is breaking bread and, passing around the cup of wine, establishing the new covenant, and they're very confused. I don't know, I've never really given that much thought. Of course they would have been confused. That's something that's never been done before, especially on Passover. And they even make the remark like, shouldn't he be praying? We've never done this before. and they realize he's established a new covenant. And I love, putting that into perspective for us. So, and also just showing kind of their obliviousness, how they're gung-ho and all in for Jesus, but they really don't quite understand the magnitude of who he is, what he is, and what's coming. Even when they're telling him, I have to go, he's telling them, I have to go away, and you can't come with me. And they're upset and they're sad, even though he's been telling them this whole time, like, this is going to happen. They're still like, it's not clicking. And it's very human, and it's just so normal and natural. So I love how they took that liberty in showing us how the disciples would have responded to Jesus, in these situations, and also how Jesus probably would have acted in these situations, because this was his last night with his best friends. And he knew what was coming, he knew the pain that was coming, and just the sadness on his face, and just the longing in his heart for the people around him, and knowing that Judas was going to betray him, and that the disciples were going to run away, that Peter was going to betray him, and getting us to see this very personal and human flesh side of Jesus, because he's fully man and fully God. Seeing him pray in the garden, sweat of blood dripping down his face. They could have gone a little bit more with that, but I'm pretty sure they wanted to keep the rating what it was. I enjoyed the movie. I really did. I just thought it was a little bland. It was a little boring. It was kind of missing a center. But I love what they did with the text. I love that. The way the characters were written kind of bugged me. Like, I don't see the problem in taking liberties with how these characters would have been, expanding them a little bit. Instead, they focused on the most familiar trait about, Peter, John, Judas, Judas being a little shifty, John being just obsessed and just loving Jesus, and then Peter being, a hothead. And really just taking those very familiar traits and building characters around that. And that's pretty much how we saw them the entire time, instead of, giving us flesh and blood human beings that have highs and lows. Is it the best Christian film I've seen? No, absolutely not. I wouldn't even say it's top 10 of what I've seen in the last 2-3 years, but not bad. I think there were some things that were done very well. I just wish the picture as a whole was better.